Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you for coming to the University of Deusto and to this frame seminar, this two-day seminar on challenges to the effectiveness of the European Union human rights and democratization policies. Before we start with the work, I would like to introduce you to two key persons for this project. The first one is our director of the Institute of Human Rights, Professor Gorka Urrutia, and the second one is Professor Jans Wouters, who is the coordinator of this frame project. Professor Gorka Urrutia is doctor in international and intercultural studies, and he's a specialist on human rights and diversity issues. He has worked with NGOs, governmental and international organizations in the field of international cooperation in Europe and South America, and his currently research focuses on human rights, migration, diversity, and religion. Professor Jans Wouters is the Frame Project Coordinator. He's Jean Monnet Chair at Personam, EU and Global Governance, full Professor of International Law and International Organizations, and the founding director of the Institute for International Law and of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, which is an interdisciplinary center of excellence at the University of Leuven, where he teaches public international law, the law of international organizations, the law of World Trade Organization, space law, and international humanitarian law. So with these brief introductions to their extensive series, I would like to give the floor to Professor Gorka Urrutia.
Thank you, Cristina. Lagun maiteok, egun dan hori, Giza Eskubideen Institutoko taldearen izenean, ongi etorria ematen dizuet Deustoko Unibertsitatera. Gaur hasi behar dugun mintegi honetan jarri duzuen interesagatik gure eskerrak azaldu nahi nizkizueke lehenik. We're saying, good morning and thank you for joining us today in this seminar. I would like to welcome you to the University of Deusto in the name of the team of the Human Rights Institute. This seminar is organized in the framework of the FRAME project, fostering human rights among European policies. The University of Deusto is part of this collaborative research project funded under the 7th Framework Program. I would like to highlight our pleasure to be part of it, and in this case to contribute in the organization of the seminar that we are holding here today. Challenges to the effectiveness of the EU human rights and democratization policies. First, I would like to say some brief words on the work that we developed at the Pedro Arrupe Human Rights Institute. Our work centers on 3 large action programs. Firstly, training and teaching program through several postgraduate programs, such as the NOAA on humanitarian action, the EMA on human rights and democratization issues, and the European Masters on human rights and on policies and practices. Secondly, the research program through several research projects such as the FRAME. And thirdly, the dissemination and social impact program through publications of the Institute and collaboration with civil society and public institutions. Most of these activities focus on several priority areas of the Institute, which bring together human rights concerns that the Institute considers to be preferably. Humanitarian action and human rights, crisis and humanitarian conflicts, migration, integration and social cohesion, and thirdly, cultural diversity and human rights, citizenship and multiculturality. In relation to this framework and the topic of the seminar, I would like to provide a first issue that I'm sure it will be addressed along the seminar, and that lately has been of great debate in the Institute. It has been, and it is still, of great debate, and as a matter of fact, interrelates our main research lines. I'm referring to the refugee crisis that we are facing and the challenges that, from a human rights perspective, interpellates us. The universality of human rights is questioned with what is happening in the Mediterranean and with the response that we are giving to it. This is not something new. The debate on the interrelation of migration, human rights, and democratization policies is, and has been, of constant actuality, and the big challenge for Europe and the values related to human rights. For what I have seen from the program, the high quality of the speakers and their background, I'm sure the presentations will feed us with light to these challenges. I wish you the best for these days, hoping that the debates contribute to a more effective human rights and democratization policies. Lastly, I would like to thank my colleagues of the Institute that have been very much involved with the seminar, especially Nieves, Maria, Felipe, Cristina, Esther, and Dolores. All of them have been involved with great enthusiasm in the organization of this seminar and also during these years with the project. I wish this fruitful collaboration will continue in the future. Thank you for coming to Deusto, and I hope you enjoy your stay in Bilbao. Thank you.
So I would like now to give the floor to Professor Jan Wouters. And before I forget, and someone would like to kill me, please, you know that you can join the conversation through the social network Twitter using Frame Bilbao. Please, Jan.
Good morning, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, friends of Frame. It's a great pleasure to be here in Bilbao, and I would like to start with expressing my sincere gratitude and compliments to the University of Deusto, the Pedro Arrupe Human Rights Institute, for an impeccable organization of this wonderful and very promising seminar that we will have today and tomorrow. I would like to very warmly thank also Felipe, Cristina, and their team for their efforts and for bringing together such a distinguished cast of speakers. So I really look forward to very stimulating discussions. As Frame General Coordinator, let me briefly share with you a couple of remarks concerning what I would call the state of Frame, our project. First of all, I can already tell you that Frame as a project is in a much better shape than the European Union for the moment. Well, I hear people saying that's easy. In any event, we know that the European Union is currently going through, let's say, a number of simultaneous crises, because we don't see one crisis anymore. I think we can call the Union now an ever more beleaguered Union in a certain way, because we have seen the financial crisis over the past couple of years with all the fallout and all the impact upon economic, social, and cultural rights. We have seen the refugee, the migrant crisis, and the sometimes ugly deals that have been made in this respect and that we see now currently being operationalized. I think partly to a heavy price for the credibility of the European Union as a human rights actor. And we see, of course, also some of the other crises popping up. I come from Belgium. 22nd of March, you know what happened in Belgium. Terrorism is, of course, with us for many decades, and I don't need to tell anything to our country colleagues here in Spain, but we have seen this becoming ever more, let's say, spectacular, and now it has struck really at the heart of Brussels, at the European headquarters, so to say. If you have ever used the subway station and got off in Maalbeek, you know what I mean. And so there too, terrorism, the whole security and other responses that are coming to it will, of course, again raise issues not just of privacy, but of many other aspects of human rights. And then there's the overall context, which I think is seeing Europe becoming ever more, let's say, challenged by particular situations in member states. I would not call it just the rise of populism, that's a bit too simplistic. There is the whole Brexit debate. We have seen last week a referendum in the Netherlands about the EU association agreement with Ukraine. And there you always see coming in a certain way from below, from the populations, a very deep sense of dissatisfaction with the Union. There is a dissatisfaction with the lack of leadership. There is a dissatisfaction with what people still see as super-state Brussels, and so on and so forth. So lots of challenges to the EU. And then we add to those challenges the effectiveness of EU human rights and democratization policies. lots of things to chew upon and to discuss here in our seminar today and tomorrow. Let me just say that FRAME itself, as you know, and as it has been said, is a large-scale European research program which has kicked off in 2013, and we will continue until April 2017. So we are already, as Talleyrand would be saying, we are already seeing le commencement de la fin. Hopefully in better terms than le commencement de la fin of Napoleon Bonaparte. But I mean, no, we are already at a stage where FRAME has delivered a lot of research and where still a lot of future research will be delivered. Let me just say that we have already delivered more than 30 research reports. You'll find them all on our website. And those of you who have been reading, of course, the ones who wrote the reports, but also the ones who have been reading through the reports, you will see this is not light literature. Some of the reports are really extremely thorough and extensive, sometimes more than 250 pages. For the policymakers and people with little time, I can, let's say, offer you a kind of consolation because we do not only produce those very substantial reports, we also produce policy briefs. And I'm happy to announce that by the end of this month, there will indeed be a new policy brief for which we thank our hosts in Deusto for all the excellent work they have put into that. The next 3 months of the FRAME project will be as busy as ever because more than 20 reports will still have to be delivered in those coming 3 months. So we go through a very intensive stage of, producing reports, coordinating among many partners, because, we are 19 partners in total, making sure we meet the highest quality standards, and I'm very happy with the very well-functioning system of internal peer review that we have set up and where we really owe much to the commitment of all of the partners. So all these things, we go through a very, very busy period right now, but we are also already at a stage where we can say, yes, there is a harvest. We have already produced substantial research, and we are already at a stage where we want to share that research with many of, say, our colleagues, but also with many of the other actors out there, the European institutions, policymakers, national policymakers, of course, civil servants, the civil society, quite naturally, other stakeholders, both within Europe and outside of Europe. And as you may have noticed, FRAME is now really at the stage where we are reaching out, where we are, as the Commission calls it, disseminating our research findings. We had excellent workshops earlier this year. A month ago, many of us were together in Sevilla, in Spain. Now we are here. In, say, a month's time, we will be at EUC in Venice for another workshop more on the toolbox that we are preparing. Then in June, we will be, we will be at multiple places because we will first have our General Assembly on the 6th and 7th of June in Brussels, although let me call it Brussels-Leuven because we are still considering the whole security kind of environment. 10th of June, we will have a workshop in Dublin. And then after the summer, we really have still a string of workshops, especially in the 6 third countries that are partners of our FRAME project. So we will travel around the world, spread the news, and try to share our research findings with many of the people and stakeholders outside Europe. Let me just conclude here by saying the following. FRAME is about a critical, ongoing kind of reflection upon the EU's potential and sometimes untapped potential to deliver on its pledges in the Lisbon Treaty about human rights, about the indivisibility, the universality of human rights as it is stated in Article 21 of the EU Treaty, and what it can do in this respect. You know that we have this very, say, detailed setup, and you find that all in this beautiful brochure, which is in your documentation, where we have basically 4 clusters, and the clusters are indeed partly about the so-called factors, about the factors which hinder or enable the EU to deliver on human rights, but we also have a cluster on the actors, where we are really looking at the, say, the landscape of actors of, say, the EU itself, the member states, the international organizations, the states in third countries, NGOs, and so on, with which the European Union works together. And there is a third big cluster about the policies which the EU develops with regard to human rights. We have had a great workshop in Brussels in December last year about the trade and development, say, wing of this third cluster. We had a great workshop in Sevilla with regard to human rights violations and conflict areas. And we have now a great workshop here in Bilbao with regard to the human rights and democratization policies. Our last big cluster is exactly what we're going to see next month in Venice, when it will be really about coming to the translation into policy-relevant findings, a toolbox, indicators, policy recommendations, and so on. We are slowly but surely getting into that final phase of the project, and I'm extremely grateful that we could get there. The three cross-cutting challenges that we look at in the FRAME project, and then I will stop, is basically all about implementation, the question of how you translate the very bold commitment of the EU written down in its founding treaties, in the Lisbon Treaty, to human rights, how you come to the translation, the implementation of that bold commitment to real practice. That's the first thing, implementation. The second big challenge that we are looking at, and also here, that is the question of coherence. Coherence in its multiple dimensions. I'm not going to start with the traditional expose of the various dimensions of coherence, but what needs to be looked at is really like all the relevant actors pulling into the same direction. That is basically the essence of the coherence story. And last but not least, effectiveness. You can be very coherent, you can be implementing lots of things, but what is your impact upon the real life in Europe and in the world? How successful is the EU? These three big challenges, implementation, coherence, effectiveness, are indeed about what FRAME is looking at, and what we hope also to come out in very interesting discussions during these 2 days here in Bilbao. Thank you very much.
Professor Jan Wouters has given us the context of this FRAME project, and as he mentioned, the European Union is facing a deep and multi-layered crisis and facing many different internal challenges. One of them is the effectiveness of its human rights and democratization policy. This cannot be understood without taking into consideration also the changing international context and how it is also interrelated with the crisis the European Union is facing. Therefore, our keynote speaker is dealing with this issue, with the European Union human rights policy and the challenges to its democracy support in a changing international context. Therefore, I would like to give the floor to Professor Richard Jones. Professor Jones is in the Carnegie Endowment Richard Jones is a senior associate in the Democracy and Rule of Law program based at Carnegie, Europe. He works on EU foreign policy on issues and international democracy. He's also professor of international relations at the University of Warwick. Prior to joining Carnegie, in July 2013, he was the director of the European think tank FRIDE in Madrid, Spain.
Okay.
Please, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to contribute, I hope, to the FRAME project. I will use my time to try and answer directly the question posed by the title of the conference. What are the main challenges to the EU developing more effective strategies of democracy and human rights support? I have a slightly unusual analytical perspective. I work for a think tank in Brussels, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So our work is quite policy-oriented, but I also have an academic hat. So what I will do is to put on the table what I think are the main policy challenges, but try to extract from those some of the more analytically relevant issues that I know you are engaged with on the FRAME project. I think the starting point is that over recent years, EU democracy policies have improved. At least on paper, there are many interesting and innovative new strategies, both through the EU institutions and member states. On paper, these strategies look to be more comprehensive, more nuanced, more sophisticated. They have begun to deal with many of the criticisms that for a long time were made against EU policies during the early 2000s. Despite the economic crisis, there is still very significant amounts of money, of funds, of resources going into democracy and human rights policies. So this continues to be an area of considerable dynamism and interesting development. However, I would argue that there are a number of challenges facing this area of activity that require the EU and the member states fundamentally to review the way that they do democracy and human rights support. I think there are 5 main challenges. A change in political dynamics outside the EU within recipient states, an intensification of geopolitics, the external impact of the EU crisis, the struggle to move beyond EU governance models, and finally, global power shifts and the way that these bring in very interesting non-Western democratic actors. These, of course, are not new factors. I realize that you have touched upon many of these issues within the FRAME program, but to my mind, it is the combination of all these different challenges facing democracy support and human rights policies that require a qualitative change in the way that democracy support is delivered. To use the language of the project, one might say, rather than framing, we need a reframing of democracy and human rights policies. Some of the challenges are specific to the European Union. Many of them are more general in nature and affect the European Union, member states, but also other democracy supporters. I will run through each of these challenges, or the challenges that I think are facing the enterprise of democracy and human rights support, fairly briefly, so that then we can perhaps delve in greater depth in the questions and answers into each of these principal challenges. The first challenge, changing political dynamics in recipient states. Here I think a number of things are happening simultaneously. Recent evidence is that democratic transitions are becoming more variable. The experience of political change is becoming more varied. If you look at the comparison of countries like Egypt with countries like Ukraine, you can see today it's very difficult to extract any very generalizable norms or laws of political change, and that the kind of dynamics and variables driving or inhibiting democratic change have a lot to do with the structural variables and factors that are specific to each country in which democracy supporters are acting. This, of course, requires strategies that are very much more tailored to the specificities of target states. Of course, European diplomats would all say that they do tailor their policies to individual countries, that they do not work to a simplified paradigm of democratic transitions. To some extent, I think this is true. There is much more realization of the need for strategies that are country-specific, much more good quality political analysis being carried out to inform EU democracy and human rights policies. Nevertheless, actually when it comes down to the operationalization of EU policy, this still tends to follow a relatively familiar menu of policy options, and the assumption is still that limited amounts of political change generate an overall dynamic of political improvement, political liberalization that leads towards something that looks like full democratic consolidation. The evidence of the last decade is that that tends not to happen. Democratic transitions or putative processes of political change can move in very, very different directions. It is a challenge for the EU to grapple with that complexity and reflect it in their democracy and human rights policies. That's one thing that's happening. Another thing that's happening is at the level of civil society. People here, like Jean, know this very well. The whole nature of civil society activism is changing in many places around the world. Over the last 5 years, we have seen an unprecedented intensity of social protests. This seems to indicate that democratic activism is taking on a different form, a form that is not so organized around professional, well-organized advocacy NGOs. It is activism that depends more on very fluid kinds of social movements, relatively less hierarchical, often of making a virtue of their leaderless qualities, organized around a very much more changing and fluid set of policy objectives. Some people would argue that this is a very good sign for democratic change. Other analysts are extremely critical of this new wave of social movement-led activism. The critics would say that social movements are not terribly successful at generating democratic momentum over the longer term. Their demands are not very coherent. Social movements tend not to think in very systemic terms, and that in general they have not been successful as agents of democratic change. Clearly, there are both advantages and disadvantages to the emergence of these new types of social actors. What does that mean? It means that it's important for policymakers to understand the nuances of these social movements, and in particular, the relationship between new social actors and established civil society pro-democratic actors. In essence, the relationship between the new politics and the old politics, as many people would put it, and to reflect these changes within EU policies. At present, this changing nature of civil society activism, I would argue, has not been fully reflected in European policies. And then, so there's that challenge to reflect the changing nature of civic activism. And as a follow-on from that, a related challenge is that as the civil society sphere itself changes, regimes have become cleverer and more assertive in restricting the space available for many civil society actors. Again, this is an old and familiar issue now you will have looked at before, the whole closing space issue. The EU has begun to react to this. It's begun to realize that the need today is not simply to offer funding and training and capacity building to democratic and human rights actors, but also to find ways of protecting these actors against some extremely repressive tactics being utilized by many regimes. For a long time, many European actors thought this was a uniquely American problem. I don't think they do believe that now. The Commission, some member states have begun to implement some quite interesting and innovative ways of trying to defend or protect human rights defenders from tightening restrictions being imposed by regimes. But these are still relatively ad hoc initiatives, very good, very valuable initiatives. And there is not yet, I would argue, a coherent political strategy, a coherent political diplomatic strategy on the part of either EU institutions or member states to try and deal with this problem of governments around the world leaving increasingly less and less space for civil society actors to operate. Very instructive that in the United States, President Obama has spoken out about this. He has made this a very political issue within US foreign policy. The same is not true of European foreign policies yet. And this seems to me an obvious area where there needs to be diplomatic evolution in European policies. So that's my first cluster of challenges that I believe European actors are facing. The second relates to the intensification of geopolitics. I won't go into detail of all the different geopolitical challenges facing the EU. It's obvious that geopolitical challenges are becoming more acute, more difficult to manage, both in the east and to the south. What does this mean for democracy support? Of course, the standard analytical line is that geopolitical imperatives are increasingly cutting across democracy and human rights support, that there is a fundamental contradiction between geopolitics and democracy support. Interestingly, the official EU line is exactly the opposite. Is exactly the opposite, that geopolitics requires the EU to intensify support for democracy and human rights, that the best way of doing geopolitics is through human rights and democracy support. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle of those two positions. Supporting democracy and human rights does not always cut across geopolitical interests, but at the same time, it seems to me somewhat simplistic to say that supporting democracy and human rights will always lead to beneficial changes in strategic interests. So therefore, we need a very nuanced geopolitical lens through which we understand and research, investigate human rights and democracy policies. The EU does not yet have this geopolitical lens on democracy and human rights support. It is beginning to develop it. It is beginning to develop it. And I think this is the beginnings of a fundamental change in the way that we understand democracy and human rights support. In analytical debates, academic debates, you all know, for a decade, the way of looking at these policies has been to counterpoise values with interests. Is the EU a normative power or is it a realist power? That duality, it seems to me, begins to look increasingly anachronistic and behind the curve, given that the real challenge facing the EU is to understand how support for different types of democratic change, different types of political reform, relate to its geopolitical interests. And you can see the EU beginning to grapple with these very, very difficult challenges. Just one example to put on the table would be Ukraine, where to some extent the EU would see support for democratic change as being its geopolitical comparative advantage vis-à-vis other actors, and in particular Russia. But the type of political change that the EU is trying to support is one that is very much tailored to its strategic interests. So I believe this will be a trend that will be very much deepened in the future, the way that a geopolitical lens informs our understanding of democracy and human rights. So that's the second area. Third area of challenges facing the EU relates to the EU crisis. Of course, this is a very old and familiar point to all of you here now, the fact that the EU crisis has left the EU with a less positive image and reputation around the globe. That hardly needs exaggerating today. We all know that the EU crisis is not just about economics, it's not just about the euro, it's also about the EU's own internal democracy problems. Some of those democracy problems are about the EU's institutional democratic deficit. Some of the challenges are about threats and menaces to democracy at the national level within member states. So this is a very complex and wide-ranging set of challenges facing democracy and liberal values within the EU itself. What does this mean for external democracy and human rights support? I think it means in the future we need to understand that support for democracy and human rights will be much more of about a two-way exchange of experiences, problems, and joint challenges. The model of human rights and democracy support up to now has been a fairly simple one. It's about us having the experiences, the resources, the good democratic practices to share with the rest of the world, to share with those who want to develop more democratic systems around the world. Today, I think this kind of one-direction way of understanding EU's liberal power is no longer sufficient. The EU will need to begin absorbing interesting experiences in democratic development and human rights protection from other places around the world. So the way of doing human rights and democracy support in the future will not be so much about exporting an EU model, of saying to the rest of the world, do as we do, but rather positioning the EU in a way that it can learn experiences, act as a bridge between the challenges that are being managed outside the EU on the one hand, with the democracy challenges that European member states are themselves facing. That without idealizing democratic trends in other parts of the world, I think one can say today that there are interesting lessons and experiences that many European governments that are struggling with rising illiberalism could be absorbing from other parts of the world. How to maintain democratic practices in the midst of very stringent economic adjustment, how to deal with rising illiberal social values in a democratic context, how to manage more diverse societies and values, again, while protecting basic human rights and democratic norms. So I think in the future, democracy and human rights support will be about two-way liberal power. The EU both emitting and absorbing influences that have to do with democracy and human rights. How to operationalize that is very difficult. It is true that many European ministers, the High Representative today, are very open in saying that the EU model is not as attractive to the rest of the world as it once was, and that the EU needs to learn lessons from other places around the world. And yet, we cannot yet see that kind of sentiment being absorbed into policy initiatives in any concrete fashion. And I think for me that is the next stage of the challenge, how we actually design democracy and human rights policies that are not about the EU simply exporting its own experiences and norms, but about how different countries are struggling with the same kind of democracy-related challenges within Europe, but also beyond Europe. Fourth and penultimate cluster of challenges, limits to the EU governance model. In any EU document or speech today, it is frequently pointed out that the EU cannot in the future rely quite as heavily on exporting its own governance, standards, rules, and laws. You'll all know that academically the debate for many years has been framed around the idea of EU external governance, the EU's ability to externalize its own rules and regulations is for many people the absolute cornerstone, the distinctive feature of European human rights and democracy support. In the future, that kind of external governance will still be relevant, but I'm not sure it can be to quite the same extent the leading edge of European democracy and human rights policies. What we see around the neighborhood countries is a much greater resistance on the part of recipient countries to the idea that they should be internalizing huge amounts of EU rules and regulations. Countries from Egypt through to Tunisia, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia are being very much more selective in the kinds of EU rules and regulations and laws that they believe are beneficial to their own processes of political development. The EU has moved some way towards being more flexible in the kinds of laws it seeks to export to other countries, but I think the EU still needs to move many more steps in this direction. And it needs to understand that for many years we assumed that Europeanization was synonymous with democratization, that Europeanizing countries around the EU's borders was the best way to deepen democratic quality across the neighborhood. I think that is more doubtful today, as many governments argue that they need to have the capacity to set their own policy priorities, rather than us assuming that huge amounts of EU approximation and harmonization necessarily act to the benefit of democratic deepening. There is one very important implication of this, and that is that the EU needs to, I think, develop a form of conditionality that is much more tailored, much more targeted, and much lighter in the way that it focuses on core human rights and democratic norms. At the moment, the EU imposes conditionality on a huge range of issues in recipient countries, often on topics that have nothing to do with democracy and human rights at all. And it is expending a lot of political capital on issues that are not really aimed at the fundamental obstacles that prevent countries across the neighborhood becoming better quality democratic systems. Final point, global power shifts, an old point, but we all know non-Western powers are rising, are becoming more powerful across the world. They are becoming more active and engaged in global politics. Many of these rising powers are democracies. Many of them have incipient policies and initiatives of democracy support. Brazil, India, South Africa, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey until recently, several African countries as well. These countries now have resources of their own. They are running governance and human rights related projects. In the future, there will need to be better coordination between European democracy supporters on the one hand and these non-Western rising democracies on the other hand. At the moment, we do not have that cooperation. 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was a lot of rhetorical talk about the need to internationalize democracy support, to multilateralize the human rights dimension, to try and ensure that human rights and democracy support in the future was not simply about European actors in the United States, but that it became a genuinely internationalized, multilateralized set of policies. In the last 5 or 6 years, we have not made tangible progress on trying to make sure that really happens in practice. And the trouble at the moment is that many of these non-Western democracies are beginning to suffer themselves, beginning to retract from some of their human rights and democracy commitments, and one fears that if the EU and the US do not try to take more advantage of this potential in the short term, then this window of opportunity could be closing in terms of cooperation between Western and non-Western democracies. So they're my 5 sets of challenges that I believe democracy supporters, human rights actors have to deal with in the future. In conclusion, I would say I think there is potential. There is a greater need and demand for human rights and democracy support. Some of the challenges that I've listed offer positive opportunity. Others of them present very difficult obstacles. So there is a mixed picture out there in terms of global change, presenting both areas of positive development and areas that are far more difficult for human rights supporters to address. For me, the overriding question today is not simply whether we do more human rights and democracy support or less, but the need for us to have a qualitative change in the way that the tactics and the strategies for democracy and human rights support are defined. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for a very inspiring presentation. We were thinking, you prefer to have a turn of questions and answers now, or maybe we do it after Felipe's presentation? Yeah, because we were thinking that you have presented 5 areas of challenge to the EU that seem to be turning upside down the foundations or the assumptions of the human rights and democratization policy. And the next speaker, Professor Felipe Gomez, is in a way addressing the consequence of that, which is the gap between the delivery gap of the human rights and democratization policy. Professor Felipe Gomez is Professor of International Law at the University of Deusto, where he teaches courses on international law and human rights. He is National Director of the European Master's Program in Human Rights and Democratization, the EMA program, at the University of Deusto. And he is one of the coordinators of he is the team leader at Deusto University of the FRAME program. So please, Felipe, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Yes, thank you very much, Christina, for the presentation, and also thank you to Richard for a very inspiring and illuminated keynote. And actually, I'm also going to deal with some of the issues that Richard just has mentioned, and I basically agree with his comments and with his very thorough analysis. Well, first of all, I mean, the aim of my presentation is basically to analyze the factors and the elements that condition the impact and effectiveness of EU policies in the area of human rights and democratization. And I'm going to divide my talk in 3 parts. First of all, I'm going to analyze the methodological limitations. We have to start by recognizing that there are methodological constraints in trying to measure impact of EU human rights and democracy policies. Second, the influence of the international context, how the international context is influencing the way in which the EU is dealing with these issues. And finally, the main challenges, and I'll identify basically 5 challenges for the EU. Well, since the end of the Cold War, the EU has projected itself as a normative power Europe. Accordingly, human rights have become one of the essential pillars of EU's identity at both internal and external level, at least as a proclamation of principles. With the adoption of the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, the EU started to pay a particular attention to human rights and democratization issues in its relations with third countries. Since then, the EU has significantly upgraded its human rights and democratization policies vis-à-vis third countries, and has placed human rights and democracy, using the words used by the European Commission, at the heart of EU external action. Well, the Lisbon Treaty represents the culmination of a process in which the EU has tried to legally ground human rights and democracy as core goals, core objectives of its foreign policy. Both the preamble and Articles 1 and 2 of the Lisbon Treaty state that the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. But the key provision as to the role of human rights and democracy in its relations with third countries is Article 21. As you can see, this is a very ambitious and very far-reaching provision in which the EU established that its action on the international scene, on the international arena, shall be guided by the principles that have inspired its own creation, development, and enlargement. And these principles are democracy, the universality and divisibility of human rights and fundamental freedoms, human dignity, equality, solidarity, respect for the principle of the UN Charter. So as you can see, human rights are the core of the EU's identity when dealing with third countries. But from the outset, there are serious concerns about the capacity of the EU to have a significant impact on the democratization processes taking place in different regions of the world. In that sense, some commentators have underlined the so-called delivery gap in the EU human rights and democratization policies, the enormous distance between the rhetoric proclamations in Brussels and the impact on the ground of the EU policies and programs. The European Commission itself is aware of it, of this delivery gap, and it has emphasized that it wants to be judged on its performance in meeting the EU's policy goals. But before we start exploring the effectiveness of EU policies, we need to be fully aware of some of the methodological challenges ahead. We have to start by recognizing the inherent methodological difficulties associated with the attempt to measure the effectiveness of impact of human rights and democratization policies and programs. While in the field of development cooperation, there's a long tradition and well-established methodologies of evaluation and impact assessment, that is not the case in the area of human rights and democratization support. This is a strong difference between these two fields of EU activity. There's neither a general methodology nor an accepted set of benchmarks and indicators to measure progress and impact. Evaluation of the effectiveness of the different instruments for the promotion of democracy is surprisingly under-researched. These are the major methodological constraints that we face when trying to ascertain the impact of human rights and democracy support programs. First of all, and Dolores Morondo is going to deepen on this issue, the first challenge has to do with the conceptual indeterminacy of the concept of democracy. While the concept of human rights is more generally accepted, given that they're anchored in the standards gradually established by international human rights law after 1945, the concepts of democracy and democratization are much more diverse, more multidimensional, and contested in local settings. And Richard has referred to it briefly, how the concept of democracy is being challenged and questioned in a number of places out there. Well, the second methodological problem has to do with attribution. We have to admit that it's very difficult to measure the impact of external assistance on human rights and democratization processes. How can you isolate the impact of a specific project or program in the multifaceted process of democratization of a country or of a region? The causal links are not clearly delineated, and other factors, a number of factors, also influence the democratization process. At the same time, there is a multiplicity of actors. So not only the EU is trying to promote human rights and democracy, there are a number of actors, mainly local, that intervene in a process of democratization. Civil society organizations, political parties, elites, economic elites, political elites, religious groups, other donors, USAID, private foundations, the Soros Foundation. That is why the political context is of utmost importance to evaluate the impact of external interventions. In this sense, the EU has incorporated a good practice that helps understand the context in which its support is going to work. The so-called country strategy papers, the CSPs, they're a step forward in trying to understand the context and also to develop tailor-made approaches and strategies to the different countries. It would be a sound policy to open the elaboration of the CSPs to the input of local stakeholders, academics, experts, local NGOs, national human rights institutions, so that they better reflect the complexities and competing interests present in local scenarios. Other reason that limits our capacity to conduct evaluations of impact is the so-called counterfactual. By definition, one cannot know what would have happened in a given process of democratization without the external support. That's why a certain degree of speculation will always be present when evaluating the impact of human rights and democracy promotion programs. And finally, we should not forget that democratization is a long-term process. While the projects and programs of international donors, such as the EU, have a much more limited time frame, it is difficult to determine the contribution of a specific program to a process of democratization. Well, the second part of my talk has to do with basically with the context that Richard has just outlined, and I basically agree with most of his comment. Well, the first question we have to respond is to what extent the West is in decline, if we are witnessing a declining in Western progress, in Western power. In the last decade, we are witnessing a progressive decline of Western power, with an increasing economic and political relevance of emerging countries such as Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the so-called BRICS, but also the Gulf states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, to name but a few. This has led to some commentators to proclaim that we've entered a post-Western world, and I'm quoting Denison and Dworkin. They affirm that we are now in a post-Western world. A new context in which the EU and the US cannot take the lead anymore in issues that have to do with the promotion of a value-based international system. Well, contrary to the prophecy advanced by Francis Fukuyama in the 90s with his idea of the end of history and the victory of the liberal paradigm after the fall of communism, now we are in a context in which we are facing a troubling weakening of human rights and democracy as shared values of universal scope. Against the background of this dramatic change in the global balance of power, Richard Youngs has alerted in a very interesting book, written some years ago, has alerted that the EU is running the risk of becoming globally irrelevant. In order to regain relevance and credibility as a normative actor, the EU needs to rethink, and I fully agree with his comments, I think that the EU needs to rethink its strategies and to reveal a North-South consensus on a new human rights and democracy agenda based on a common understanding with these rising partners on the compatibility between political rights, economic growth, social justice, and human development. In my view, and in the view of many analysts, these are four elements that need to be an integral part of any democratic agenda. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that some of these emerging countries have a rather different approach to human rights and democracy. To some extent, the so-called Beijing consensus is progressively substituting the old Washington consensus as a paradigm to be followed in many countries outside the West. The main consequence of this trend is that economic liberalization can go hand in hand with authoritarian or semi-authoritarian policies and practices. And some of these relatively powerful countries have initiated a calculated strategy of autocracy promotion in third countries to kind of counter-react to Western efforts at human rights and democracy support. Well, a particular case is in this area is the strong support by Saudi Arabia to authoritarian regimes in the MENA region to avoid any influence of the democratic wave brought about by the Arab Spring and to maintain the status quo. Saudi Arabia has been able and has been relatively successful and has been able to buy influence and undermine Western leverage for political reform. But this counter-revolutionary role played by Saudi Arabia points to one of the greatest contradictions of the values-based foreign policies of both the EU and the US. Once again, the West has prioritized security and stability over democracy and human rights, very much in line with the strategic interest of Saudi Arabia. We cannot but remember that Saudi Arabia is one of the closest allies of the West in the region, in spite of its manifestly put record on human rights and democracy. But it still is one of our closest allies. This is a crystal clear manifestation of one of the main deficits of the EU human rights and democracy policies, the so-called credibility gap. The use of double standards when European strategic interests are at stake. Obviously, this lack of credibility strongly undermines EU's legitimacy to advance a human rights and democracy agenda, thus hindering the effectiveness and impact of its human rights and democracy promotion efforts. This contradiction is clearly illustrated in the case of Egypt. Deusto is part of the FRAME project. In our work, we've had to deal, and we have to analyze the case of Egypt and the EU's policies vis-à-vis Egypt. And in our opinion, this is a very illustrative case. In Egypt, a window of opportunity for promoting democracy opened after the revolution in 2011, but 2 years later, when General al-Sisi organized a coup d'etat in July 2013 to oust Islamist President Mohamed Morsi, the counter-revolution was institutionalized with the implicit approval of the US and the EU, prioritizing strategic interests over the promotion of democratic principles. In that sense, the Arab Spring has acted as a wake-up call for an EU that for decades had supported the authoritarian regimes that offer stability and access to their natural resources in the region. So this is one of the areas, one of the examples in which this lack of credibility is more evident. Richard has also referred to the financial crisis that the European Eurozone is suffering since 2008, and this is probably the most serious crisis in the history of the EU, and is undermining the privileged role that the EU has played so far in the international financial system. Some emerging countries are strongly criticizing the supremacy of the West in the international financial institutions that were created in Bretton Woods even before the end of the Second World War in 1944. This situation also points to one major incoherence of EU's foreign policy. While being very active in promoting democracy and human rights in third countries, the EU and European countries enjoy a privileged situation in a number of international organizations, such as the International Financial Institutions, the World Trade Organization, or the Security Council of the United Nations. And in spite of increasing criticisms coming from emerging countries, the EU, together with the US, show great reluctance to accept democratic principles in the functioning of these major international organizations. The second element of the international context has to do with emerging countries as international donors. Richard has also referred to it. And as a consequence of this new geo-economic scenario, Some of these emerging powers, China, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, India, Brazil, Venezuela, they have dramatically increased their roles as international donors, competing with traditional Western donors such as the EU and the US. One of the results of this shift in the development aid pattern is that the EU's conditionality of aid to progress in human rights, that's one of the core elements of EU development cooperation, well, this EU's conditionality and, of aid to progress in human rights and democracy can be undermined, given that recipient countries may be less inclined to follow the European recipes. In this new context, we can expect that the EU will have much less leverage to push for democratic change in third countries. And the final element, the final dimension of the international context, and I'm going to be very brief because tomorrow Poonam Joshi will deepen on this issue, that's the backlash against human rights and democracy promotion. And this is also part of this new international climate brought about by the relative decline of Western power and the rise of emerging powers. And in this new context, many countries are expressing a growing hostility to the human rights and democracy support policies and programs sponsored by the EU and other international donors. These countries are progressively erecting barriers to the activities of both local and international actors. These restrictions are increasingly sophisticated and have taken the form of, for instance, new laws imposing state control mechanisms to the operation of local and international NGOs, difficulties and limitations to access foreign funding, expulsion of human rights activists working for international organizations. For instance, last week in Morocco, some European lawyers were expelled from the country because they were doing some activities in the area, in the Sahrawi context, trying to interview some political prisoners in the Sahara region, and they were expelled by the Moroccan government. The creation of government-operated NGOs, the so-called Congos, or obstacles to international election monitoring. So there are a number of areas in which these countries are more and more restrictive vis-à-vis both local and international human rights organizations. The protagonist role of civil society in the uprisings in the Arab world in 2011 only reinforced this negative perception on the parts of those in power, kind of a demonstration effect, paving the way for more repression and more obstacles to the activity of civil society organizations. This troubling situation poses once again an old dilemma to the EU, since it has to make a difficult choice, either to support the drivers of change or to continue with the traditional business as usual for the sake of stability. And finally, my last part is going to identify the challenges for an effective EU policy on human rights and democracy. Well, and these are, in my view, the main challenges. First of all, the credibility gap. Second, the model and the economic agenda behind this model. The third has to do with institutional architecture after Lisbon, human rights mainstreaming, and finally, the need for systematic evaluation. Well, first of all, the credibility gap. The EU must practice what it preaches if it wants to be considered as a credible global actor in the field of human rights and democracy promotion in third countries. According to Jan Boswit, Jan is among us this morning, and I quote, "The lack of coherence and the use of double standards has been widely identified as the Achilles heel of Western democracy promotion efforts." So this is an element that undermines both the capacity and the legitimacy of the EU to advance a human rights and democracy promotion agenda. One telling example of this incoherence is the application of the Copenhagen criteria to those countries that want to incorporate the EU. These criteria, as you all know, were adopted in 1993, and they established strict conditions in the field of human rights and democracy to candidate countries. But once these countries are accepted as full members of the EU, their human rights situations are not systematically monitored and supervised by EU bodies and mechanisms. So this is one point of incoherence that undermines the legitimacy of the EU to be vocal when dealing with human rights in third countries. There are some positive recent initiatives, such as the adoption of the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights, the creation of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, FRA, based in Vienna, the ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the future ratification, if the European Court of Justice lets the EU to ratify the European Convention on Human Rights. These all are positive attempts to upgrade the protection of human rights within the EU. But the situation of human rights in some countries of the EU is lagging behind in issues such as the protection of minorities, the rights of the Roma people, the rights of the child, or the rights of migrants and asylum seekers, as it has been pointed out in the Universal Periodic Review, in the UPR, of the UN Human Rights Council. To mention just one example, the rejection by the 28, by every member of the EU, they rejected the recommendation by the UPR to ratify the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all migrant workers and their family. This rejection, in my view, clearly undermines the coherence and the credibility of both member states and the EU as leading players in the global human rights arena. And finally, and the director of the Institute has referred to it in the opening address, the recent crisis of refugees escaping from conflicts in Syria, Libya, or Iraq is a tragic manifestation of the inability of the EU to offer common solutions based in the values and principles in which we say we believe in. It is the very European project that is at stake. So the very heart of the European project is under question now. It's extremely shocking the way in which the EU is subcontracting the solution to the refugee crisis to Turkey, promising first a huge amount of resources and also an acceleration of the negotiations of accession to the EU, irrespective of the deteriorating human rights situation in the country, in Turkey. Once again, it seems that the EU is putting more emphasis on the control of its borders in a move towards an increasing securitization of its migration policy, rather than on the protection of the rights of those seeking for asylum. And last but not least, the economic crisis that European states are suffering since 2008 is putting at serious risk the enjoyment of socioeconomic rights within the Union, since the austerity measures imposed jointly by the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, the so-called Troika, are having a dramatic impact in the increase of inequality and social exclusion in a number of EU countries, especially in the south of Europe, but in many other countries. Well, the second challenge has to do with the model of democracy and human rights and the economic agenda behind. A strong criticism of the European model of human rights and democracy promotion is associated with the underlying economic agenda. Most of the time, although not always explicitly formulated, the human rights and democracy support package is accompanied by the promotion of a liberal market economy. This is driven by the conviction that the liberalization of the economies of authoritarian countries and their integration into the world economy would pave the way for democratization. Well, this is precisely the model that is under strong criticisms after the Arab Spring, since the root causes of the revolts in the Arab region have much to do with the deep inequalities and with the deep exclusions brought about by the liberalization policies imposed by Western countries and by the international financial institutions, namely the IMF and the World Bank. A coherent and consistent human rights and democracy promotion strategy needs a totally different economic agenda, an agenda that seriously takes into account that the enjoyment of socioeconomic rights and human development are an integral part of any substantive democratic project. What is quite clear is that the EU cannot pretend simply to export its model of human rights and democracy, and I fully agree with Richard in this element, since, as we've already seen, in a post-Western world, it generates a strong and somewhat legitimate reactions and contestations. The EU needs to be more modest in its approach, paying attention to the local context, to the local actors, and to the local ways of framing concepts such as human dignity, democracy, participation, inclusion. National and local ownership are key components of any meaningful strategy of promoting human rights and democracy. This afternoon, in the panel on the localization of the EU policies, will deepen on these issues. But I'm fully convinced that local ways of understanding democracy and human rights have to be taken into account. We don't have simply to accept them, but we have to take them into account. Well, the third challenge has to do with institutional architecture, but I'm not going to deal with it because we have a panel by Véronique Arnaud and Jan Wouters on it. But I think it's also a challenge, especially in the area of the capacity and the coordination of the different bodies of the EU dealing with human rights and democracy promotion policies. But I'm going to leave it to Jan and to Véronique. And the fourth challenge has to do with human rights mainstreaming. Article 21.3 of the Treaty of the European Union makes a call to guarantee consistency between the wide range of external policies of the EU, and this is one of the main objectives, of the core objectives of the EU in this area. Lack of consistency is one of the main long-standing criticisms of the EU's action in the field of human rights and democracy. This is always the case, that we always criticize this lack of consistency. But as it has been pointed out by some scholars, the objectives of the EU are not always compatible in practice. We have to be aware of this. Sometimes there are competing interests when dealing with human rights and democracy. For example, on human rights issue, insisting on human rights issue with some countries can deteriorate relations with some countries and impede cooperation on issues such as climate change, migration, or the fight against terrorism. We have to be aware of it. Sometimes there are competing interests. And we must recognize that it's always difficult for the EU to reconcile values on the one hand and interests on the other. At the same time, there is a tendency to deal with human rights and democracy as separate issues in its external relations. Human rights and democracy mainstreaming is a challenge if the EU wants to use in a systematic and complementary manner the different instruments and the different programs that the EU has at its disposal. Two areas have been identified where the need for mainstreaming is more pressing, and I would emphasize in the area of trade and in the area of development. Some significant progress has been made. We have to recognize that progress has been made, but there are both technical and political difficulties when dealing with these efforts, both in Brussels and in EU delegations. The EU has to develop strategies and specific tools, specific mechanisms to systematically and effectively mainstream human rights and democracy as an integral dimension of all its external policies. The EU has a great potential to advance human rights and democracy if it uses all its policies in a coherent and consistent way. And finally, the final challenge that I've identified, and I will also very brief because tomorrow Jan Bosuit will refer to the issue of evaluation. He's an expert on the area of evaluation. But I think that, that the need for systematic evaluation is a pressing need for the EU. Well, both the European Commission and the European Parliament, they make annual reports on the activities developed by the EU in the area of human rights and democracy promotion, but in my view, they cannot be considered as a proper evaluation of said activities. They're rather a detailed description of those activities, but it's not a proper and a systematic evaluation. What the EU really needs is a systematic assessment of the impact of its role in the promotion of human rights and democracy. It needs an evaluation so that it can learn from its own experience, becoming a learning organization. A reliable and professional evaluation should be as transparent and as sincere as possible, identifying unintended or unexpected impacts. Unfortunately, this is not always the case, and this is not the general trend in evaluations commissioned by donors. And evaluations tend to be influenced by what I refer to as a culture of complacency. That's at least my experience when analyzing the evaluations made so far on the activities of the EU in the field of human rights and democracy. The evaluation exercise should finish with a brief and precise set of recommendations so that the EU can react and modify accordingly its policies and practices. Institutional memory and learning capacity are vital, are crucial to improve the performance of human rights and democratization programs, but experience tells that it's very difficult to transfer the knowledge developed by the evaluations into real institutional and policy change. A number of reasons can be mentioned, and I'm referring to the EU, but for those of us working at universities, but also in the private world, it's always difficult to integrate the conclusions of evaluations. It's always difficult. And there's always a reaction against being evaluated, everywhere, and the EU is not an exception. There are a number of reasons that can be mentioned as obstacles to the effectiveness of recommendations, and I would like to emphasize bureaucracy and institutional inertia, personal and institutional resistance. There's always the personal component. And finally, the political control of the process. So these are, in my view, the main obstacles for the effectiveness of the evaluation. Well, let me conclude by saying that, as we've seen, the EU has both the ambition and the potential to become a global human rights actor, but both the changing international context and the challenges that I've tried to identify are significant obstacles that need to be overcome. I do hope that this seminar and the FRAME project as a whole help in this endeavor. Many thanks.